All right, I just wanted to shift focus just a bit here to talk about how this emerging idea of identity in the New World and among English colonists began to emerge, and how that begins to um, interact with non-European populations. Um, and specifically, we're talking about relations with Native Americans and relations with African African slaves coming from sub-Saharan Africa. So, in England, which was a an advancing economy with the advent of its involvement in colonial settlement, as early as the 1620s, in England itself, slavery, or bondage as it was referred to, was still technically legal in England. However, the practice had virtually died out by the time of the Renaissance. What's interesting here is that, and kind of ironic, is that on the one hand, while you have slavery just being abandoned for all intents and purposes in England, it was the labor alternative of choice for meeting the labor intensive needs in the colonies. So it wasn't tolerated. It wasn't something that was necessary um, in England itself, but where you had very labor intensive economies, where you had people through the mercantilist system, which many of you pointed out in your posts in the discussion board, rightfully so. Uh, Mercantilism, in many respects, is going to uh, maximize the profit making off of the gathering of raw materials in the New World through the use of slave labor in many respects, because it's mostly an agrarian type of society that is going to be first uh, developed in the colonial world. So, slavery, the institution of slavery itself, in an economic sense, could be interpreted as um, signifying a degree of economic advancement or lack thereof. Okay, that more advanced economies typically don't engage in or have a need to rely on slave labor, um, whereas kind of emerging economies like we see in the colonies most certainly did. As far as the institution of slavery in the English colonies, the earliest record of slaves, the first record of slaves, African slaves, coming to the English colonies is in 1619. So that's within 20 years of first settlement, the first successful settlement in Jamestown. Um, and again, the English here see slavery as a necessity, an economic instrument, um, to solve the problem of chronic labor shortages. But as we just seen in the previous segments, talking about colonial society in the English colonies, what their sense of mission was, as far as whether you're a separatist or non-separatist, in outlook within the Puritan community, as far as sense of mission, either to reform the old world or to break away freely from it, as far as spiritual salvation was concerned. The issue of slavery is going to be a particular um, problem from a moral standpoint. I mean, just think about it. The justification, trying to justify uh, in this environment of establishing the colonies, especially in New England, um, imbued with a sense of moral purpose and optimism, the question quickly becomes one of, well, how could people claiming to represent the last best hope of creating a utopian society claim to uphold slavery? And there were a number of strategies cobbled together to try and justify and um, uh, legitimize this you know paradox, this sense of irony. One was through cultural values. Colonists interpreted slavery as a punishment for a crime or the result of captivity and war. Um, Puritans themselves saw sloth as sin, so that everyone needed to pull their weight and work for the good of the community. It was a way of maintaining social order. Um, the application of slavery. That there was a necessity to focus on differentiating civilized from savage. This is most applicable when colonists interacted with Native American populations and also Africans, saying that neither of these communities, these non-European populations, were Christianized or Christians in many respects, and that this therefore could be a justification for slavery or enslaving those populations. To carry that through to its conclusion briefly, this is getting out of a chronological order slightly, but what's interesting to note is that even when Native Americans and Africans converted to Christianity, they remained slaves, and by 70 or 1700, colonies like Maryland, New York, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, all these colonies had laws on the books allowing for slaveholders to retain ownership over their slaves, even if those slaves converted to Christianity and became Christians. Some historians argued that nationality entered into the equation, so that there's the idea of this dichotomy between English and non-English. Colonists also began to search for more permanent distinctions and markers that would help establish that, and that's where and how race becomes the marker of choice here. That white would equal free, English, Christian, and black would be interpreted as slave, non-English, and sometimes even heathen. Um, while and even among whites, the complexion could be help reinforce social status in some cases. That is to say, that people that toiled outside, in the working the land themselves, not enjoying the social advancement to the point where they could have others do the work. If they were forced to work the land themselves, then this was somehow more kind of emblematic of lower rank or poorer colonists. So that became kind of a distinguishing marker even within the community. Only a generation after the first slaves came to the English colonies, and we're talking about basically mid-century, about 1640, slavery had become perpetual and hereditary in the colonies of Maryland and Virginia. Slaves would remain slaves for their entire lives, and their children would be born into slavery as well. And these concepts were a New World phenomenon. Um, Geography did not matter really as far as geography was concerned along the eastern seaboard. Slavery existed throughout the colonies during the early, all of the colonies during the early era, um, early settlement period. In New England, in particular, as in 1637, following what was known as the Pequot War, with local Native American tribes. It was a particularly bloody conflict. Basically, the Native Americans used kind of more hit and run, guerrilla tactic type of style of combat, whereas the militia of the colonists were, fought in more linear types of formations. Um, the English traded as a, during this time of this war. The English traded enslaved Indians for African slaves. Puritans themselves accepted the institution of slavery. Now, what's going to happen is, and we'll get to this in a moment, but what's going to happen is that over time, over the intervening decades, slavery is going to diminish. It's going to begin to just fall into disuse and fall out of favor for those populations, primarily in the northern colonies. And we'll get into reasons why as we move forward here. In Virginia and Maryland and throughout the South, we have the establishment of an agrarian society, but again, based on these large, expansive plantations, hundreds, sprawling for hundreds of acres. Tobacco, other kind of labor-intensive crops were sown and harvested, and so the demand for a labor force that was mobile but not independent, that was cheap but not temporary, and that was unskilled, was required, and slavery is going to check all those boxes to meet all those needs. Again, in an agrarian society, there is the labor needed is unskilled by and large. And that's a standard characteristic for agricultural societies around the world, that they wanted long-term help that could be manipulated in order to maximize profits in the new world. They wanted workers without their own agendas, and of course, again, because of the expansive nature of large plantations, it fed into and kind of reinforced the need for a workforce that was dependable and enslaved. New England farmers held much smaller plots of land, so they could be managed more easily. They didn't require as many slaves in order to, meet the needs of the running of the farms themselves, and they could be managed. In some cases, the homesteaders, the colonists, could manage those properties themselves if they had a large enough kind of local network of family, say, or something, or even indentured servants, as we'll see. But so the nature of the land, the topography, the soil compositions, the size of the farms that we're talking about is going to be also part of the equation in understanding the dynamics of the institution of slavery in North America, in the English colonies. I mentioned just a second ago about indentured servitude. This is another form, another alternative or institution that was relied upon with varying degrees of success, really, to meet labor needs. You remember that many, I believe it's just in the previous segment, many English that wanted to move, come across to start afresh, maybe in the English colonies, could not afford to do so on their own. Um, so this is where indentured servitude kind of helped meet the needs of the person transiting across the Atlantic, but also meeting labor needs on the other end once they arrived in the New World. Terms were laid out as follows. An individual in the New World would sponsor or pay the way for an individual to come from New England to the New World, and in return, and these were ads that were posted in newspapers in England. Um, in return, the newcomer to the colony would work for his or her sponsor to pay off that debt. The work lasted anywhere from usually 4 to 7 years by contract, or until the person was 21 years old. So a very young demographic here. Uh, they were an indentured servant. This individual could be bought and sold, could be used to settle debts with other colonists. The indentured servant was completely subservient to his or her master, and so again we see this servant-master relationship not only with the institution of slavery with African slaves, but also that kind of association within the broader uh, dynamic or mechanism of mercantilism. The master of in the um, relationship with indentured servants would provide clothing, food, shelter, even sometimes an education to the indentured servant or for the indentured servant. But in places like Virginia and Maryland, indentured servants were initially treated rather poorly, and this, in some cases, they were outrageously abused, um, leading to these indentured servants, either one running away or two um, going simply breaking the contract and hopping a ship back to England. When terms of service expired, then these indentured servants were provided with the essentials by their sponsor, their master. This would again include clothing, food, and sometimes even a bit of money to get the now freed servant started on their own independently. So um, it's interesting to note also that particularly with historical examples in Virginia and Maryland, you have this overlap between indentured servitude and slavery, and so it is the the potential for abuse and exploitation within the indentured servitude ranks is kind of a interesting dynamic. As we move forward into the 18th century and even beyond towards the American Civil War in the mid 19th century, we're going to continue to track this underlying kind of tension that revolving around the institution of slavery itself. So something to keep in mind. It's laying obviously the foundation for it here, and we'll see as we get into the Great Awakening, as we get into moving towards the American Revolution and beyond. Exactly get to more specific examples of that kind of not evolution of the but the scope of the debate and how it changes would be the best way to put it. So that rounds out our lecture here for talking about colonial society, what was at stake, and the seedlings of American identity that begin, and their foundation, how they get started, what the main points of flashpoints of conflict within communities, but also between communities as well, and also between peoples, free people, slaves, indentured servants, all in the amidst the unfolding of a mercantilist policy, and how England, among others, is going to try and address those needs and issues. I know we've been very English heavy here. We'll take a look at France as well, and then start getting out of Europe. But it's necessary, obviously, with talking about North America, having to kind of do a deeper dive here as far as the nature of society, and the social ingredients that comprise it. So we'll pick up with a look, expanding, kind of again looking at France in particular, and then and get back to Europe, a European focus, but before moving into the Eurasian continent. All right, take care.